Pivot, don't pause. Insight from the 2008 Great Recession. You are indeed in the right place. I'll take 30 seconds to explain who I am and why I started kind of studying all of this and why I think hopefully it's important for all of you and all of you that are involved in business and companies and that are trying to kind of grow even through these unprecedented times. So I'm a CEO of Top Global. We're a network of 9 different agencies with a global footprint around the world. We're a global marketing agency. We're known for specific agencies such as PR Hacker, which is a data-driven viral PR agency. And we do things like PR, advertising, digital, social, influencer marketing, sales enablement. These are the kind of topics we do. And one of the things I'm really fascinated about, which is why I started working on this webinar, is how companies can overperform. And specifically, what are the qualities that help companies do that? And I think there's nothing more interesting, actually, than looking at times of crisis and times of recession. And so that's where this webinar started, was can we look at what happened in 4 recent recessions? The characteristics of this one, or the causes of this one, is very different. But the financial implications for companies is very similar. And a great place to start out, and feel free to kind of jump in, ask questions anytime. Justin, my producer, is on the line and he'll help kind of moderate and screen those. But a great place to start is this notion that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And the idea and the concept here, and this happened in basically all of the past kind of 4 major recent economic disruptions, and we'll talk about specifically what those are and what we can learn from each one. But the common characteristic of all of them is that it's actually a time machine for the right company, meaning it accelerates everything. That means it accelerates your ascent, it accelerates your decline, it accelerates market disruption, it accelerates market shakeup. If you look at all 4 of those recent crises together, 85% of the companies who were market leaders when they started, when they entered these crises, were not market leaders when they left. So someone has to be the leader. So if it's not, for the most part, those who entered, it's an incredible time where everything is different, everything changes, and your sense of strategy, your sense of leadership, your sense of following the right course is amplified to a greater degree. So put another way, it's kind of like money, where money just kind of amplifies what's already inside of you. These crises amplify what companies are made of. It puts it in sharp reveal, and that has a huge effect on your future, the future of your employees, and the future of your industries. So let's take a deeper look. And basically over the past 2 months, I'm going to share some of the things that I've been studying, I've been trying to implement with my own company, and also all of the clients that we advise. So first of all, let's look at the 4 major financial crises, and these are the 4 we're going to look at. The 2008, it's kind of the most famous one right now, the Great Recession. The 2000, the dot-com bubble. So I know a lot of people attending this webinar today are in the tech industry. You're in the tech industry and you're around then, you know the dot-com bubble well. The 1990 slowdown, as well as the 1980 decline. So all of these had different causes, but they had the same disruptive effect on companies. Some, like the Great Recession, were more like triggered by kind of disruptions in the housing market. Others by energy crises. So the causes, and of course this one, the current COVID-19 pandemic we're in, it's totally something different, obviously, where a communicable disease triggers the crisis. But the characteristics, once you get past the different triggers, are actually quite similar. So there's a lot we can learn. So we can look at each of those 4 and try to distill this notion, which is which companies significantly outperformed their rivals and why. And I'm not just going to sort of assert this, I'm going to actually show you some data. What's nice about these recession periods in terms of studying them is that a lot of academics, a lot of businesses, there's actually a lot of literature about this, and a lot of testing and measurement is done. So you actually, at TOP, we believe TOP stands for test, optimize, perform. We believe in using data. And so let's look at the data now. So first of all, let's look at the 3 types of strategic approaches so we can measure their effectiveness that happens in a crisis. Number one is prevention focused. Number two is promotion focused. And number three is dual focused. So these are the three primary types. Prevention focused, the first one, which is probably the most prevalent, is a defensive strategy. It is essentially, let's cut costs, let's fortify the ship, let's go back to the foundation. It's defensive. It's let's prevent something worse from happening because things are bad, right? If we have 30 million people now in the current pandemic who have been laid off, a lot of that stems from prevention-focused strategies. For some companies, it was necessary. For others, it's like, we don't know how bad this is going to get. There's a lot of unknowns. So we're going to be defensive. That's the first strategic approach. Second strategic approach in a crisis is promotion focused. So there's a certain subset of companies that says, you know what? We go counter to what everyone else does. So they're retrenching, let's go, right? If they can, they're saying, okay, let's ramp this up. Maybe they're in industries that are less affected by the overall crisis. So there's like, let's go. Let's be bold. Let's be aggressive. So if prevention focused is defensive strategy, promotion focused is offensive strategy. And then the third type of strategic focus that when we're going to look at the stats on all of this is dual focus. So essentially, there's a certain group of companies that are able to be defensive and offensive at the same time. So defensive, certain things are going to retrench. Let's look at maybe what do they retrench. And then certain things are going to be aggressive. They're going to be like, we need to double down in these areas. So they're able to have this dual focus lens. And here, looking at the data from the past 4 recessions, here is what the results look like. So first of all, prevention-focused companies seek to cut costs faster and deeper than their rivals. If we can be more defensive faster, we can outlast this crisis. And for those companies, 21% have a chance of post-crisis success. So for those companies, about 1 in 5 can be successful, which is to continue to not only exist, but actually can exist and grow, similar to pre-crisis rates. About 21% chance of doing that. That's if you're defensive-minded. So defensive-minded, sometimes companies view it as a necessity, but it's not an incredibly successful strategy for a crisis. Second approach is promotion-focused companies who boldly invest much more than their rivals, right? So, okay, if everyone else is retrenching, now let's invest. What can we do, right? You'll see companies, for instance, that everyone else is laying off people. They'll hire all those people up, right? So they're doing counter the approach because they sort of see opportunity to be aggressive. So those kind of companies, look at the past 4 recessions, they have a 26% chance of post-crisis success. So it's actually better than the 21% for the defensive, the offensive 26%. So in balance, still not a fantastic chance of success, but obviously this is a disruptive event, so it's going to be difficult to succeed. But on balance, a little bit better if we look at 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2008 to be offensive rather than defensive. And by the way, if you just kind of look at those 4 crises, and if you look at now, 2020, you can see that while it seems like these sort of disruptions are unusual, one of a kind, really unique events, they actually happen about every 10 years. So in some ways, we were overdue for this one, even though if the cause is totally novel. Okay, so we looked at defensive, 21%. We looked at offensive, 26%. Now let's look at sort of progressive companies, or what I call the dual focus lens, that combine defensive moves with strategic offensive amplification. And for these companies, there's a 37% chance of post-crisis success. So that's a significant jump, right? We had 5% difference, defensive versus offensive. But if you can do this mix of defensive and offensive, then suddenly your results of success jump significantly. Now, of course, it matters, right? What's defensive? What's offensive? And we're going to start looking at that and breaking that down. But the idea is that it's not, just a singular defensive or offensive focus. And so that's even where the name of this webinar comes from, Pivot, Don't Pause. The pause is at the core of the defensive strategy, the prevention strategy. And actually, there's more value and there's more growth we have if you pivot and particularly if you pivot with a dual focus lens. You need to be defensive and offensive at the same time. And so these are the top 9%. And across the past 4 recessions, 9% of companies overall are the crisis conquerors. They are the ones, and I've defined this as they grow more than 10% in terms of sales and profits over their rivals, at least 10% during a crisis. The crisis conquerors effectively become stronger through the crisis. They have more market share, better market position, better growth prospects, even if they decline initially in the crisis. So put another way, this is what the chart looks like. So in the blue, you can see those are the crisis conquerors, right? They have the downturn. You can see that this is a chart for the 2008 Great Recession. You can see, like all companies, there's a downturn, right? And I should say the blue is the crisis conquerors. The gray is the overall market. And the kind of, orange is the kind of the lower performing rivals, basically the rivals that do essentially the suboptimal strategy of pure prevention, that actually basically they retrench, cut costs sharply and deeply, and are unable to recover as quickly. Now, a couple things, just looking at this graph in crisis conquerors that outperform rivals at least 10%. So one, you can see the crisis conquerors, the overall market, even the lower performing companies, they all, during a downturn, there's a downturn, right? Very hard to turn your downturn into going the opposite way, right? So on average, there's still going to be an effect. But you'll notice for the crisis conquerors, the downturn is not quite as deep. And this was, 2008 Great Recession was a big event, right? So it's a downturn, it's similar, but it's not quite as deep as everyone else. Then what you'll also notice from this combination of dual focus lens, defensive and offensive strategy, is that their growth curve after is steeper. So something is happening during that downturn in their optimal strategy, and that combination of defensive and offensive, that sets them up for faster growth. One, the downturn is more shallow. Two, growth is steeper afterwards, and noticeably steeper. And so much steeper that by the time you get to 2017, where this graph starts, and you go through the downturn, the recovery, and the growth phase, suddenly was in the y-axis, is basically overall shareholder return, is so much dramatically different that essentially the entire course and trajectory and destiny of this company has fundamentally changed. So that brings us to, what do they do? What do the crisis conquerors do? And what is the optimal combination of defensive and offensive for the dual focus lens? And please, also, if any of this is confusing, you want more detail, or you just have a comment or an idea, jot it down in the chat room and sort of the Q&A questions. Justin, my trusty producer from Austin, Texas, is there. He'll help vet those and get those to me. And I'd love to answer those questions. So now that we know we want to be a crisis conqueror, what are 6 ways to pivot? And by pivot, we mean that optimal combination of defensive and offensive strategy, and then conquer. What do the crisis conquerors do, and how can we do it? So the first point is cut costs without sacrificing the future. So there's a certain point where in really tough times, you have to be, to some extent, defensive. You have to cut costs. But the manner in which crisis conquerors cut costs is totally different from everyone else. Remember, crisis conquerors are the top 9%. So the typical way to cut costs, and certainly we've seen a lot of evidence of this over the past couple of months, is cut hard costs that just reduce cost as fast as possible while keeping the core business intact. So essentially, what's usually for most companies, what's that biggest cost is labor, right? So you just cut labor. And it's the fastest way because most people are not on, are employed at will. So they can be laid off quickly, or alternately with labor, they can have salaries reduced quickly. That's the primary way to do this. What is interesting is when you look at the data, reducing labor costs is not the primary focus of crisis conquerors. They are actually reducing cost more so by becoming more efficient. So there may be some labor reduction cost, but they're actually doing this by making their processes, their systems, their technology more efficient to deploy the value they need. This is really significant, and you see this across like all of the studies of all of the different recessions. This is like, if there's such a thing as a universal truth, this is it. Is that essentially the crisis conquerors, or the top performers, have to cut cost without sacrificing the future. And the way you do that is that improving a process or a system or a technology to deploy your core value as a company, that lasts with you when recovery begins. The labor cut does not. So the issue is that when we're in a downturn and things aren't looking as good, and you cut labor, you're basically cutting, usually with a layoff, a lot of people that actually you need. So you're saying, okay, it's necessity, we just can't do it. But then what happens is things recover, you've got to hire back all of those people, right? Then you're growing after recovery, it's growth. You need to hire even more people. So essentially, when you focus just on labor for cost reduction, you're actually reducing your ability in the long term to grow quickly. And you're also delaying your growth because you won't have the right people. It's suboptimal from a mid or long-term perspective, even though it could get down your cost the fastest in the short term. Crisis conquerors, on the other hand, they're focused on systems and processes. Like, how can we deliver this result for the customer or this result for the consumer with less touches, less handoffs, more automation, more technology, better training, better customer success. All of those sorts of things improve your efficiency. And what happens is the minute the switch flips and we're in recovery, then suddenly all of those gains fuel the crisis conqueror, fuel the top performing company, and they just grow. While the other companies, unfortunately, the other companies are unable, and there's a delay. They don't have the right personnel, and there's a delay in their being to respond. And that difference gives basically first mover advantage to the crisis conqueror in the recovery. So that's number one. So how can you cut costs but improve your systems, your processes, your efficiency, your technology to deploy value? If you focus on that, even when you might have to make some overall adjustments to labor as well, because there's certain realities the business face, and you try to do that in the most thoughtful way about the welfare and the well-being of your team and your employees, even if there has to be some, because the business might not survive, the focus needs to be on efficiency and effectiveness, because that lasts with you as a short-term benefit, but doesn't sacrifice the long-term. Brings us to point number 2. Invest in the drivers of growth. We talked about defensive strategy. Now let's talk about offensive strategy, and specifically what crisis conquerors do to invest in growth. And the issue is that there basically needs to be a shift to those areas that are going to drive not only the opportunity now to limit the downturn, but that also in the mid and long term will actually basically steepen your growth curve. There are 3 recession growth drivers when you look across all of the studies and all of the literature and all of the companies. And by the way, there's some awesome case studies to check out where you kind of see it's like you can look at, for instance, recession growth drivers, like compare for the Great Recession, Staples versus Office Depot, right? And see what Staples is investing in, which was top performer, Office Depot, which did not invest. And it's really stark contrast, but it comes down to 3 things. So one is R&D, research and development. It's a great time in a crisis, and we'll even talk about this later, to roll out new products, new innovations, new approaches. Why? Because there's one huge disruption of the market players. So usually, sometimes as a company, the life cycle of a company, you have a great idea, but it's a great idea and you're going up against Apple and Google and Microsoft. It's like they're going to squash it, right? But in a disruption, market players are disrupted. Big market leaders are disrupted. People are taking their eye off the ball. So your opportunity for rapid fire investment in R&D to then deploy products or services or value has a greater chance of being able to succeed. So one is R&D. 2, across all the board, across all 4 recessions, marketing. Investing in marketing, and specifically investing in the type of marketing now that can limit your trough and limit sort of the downturn during the crisis or the recession, but then can power the growth afterwards. So what happens, and the characteristics of the 4 recessions, is that when recovery begins, it happens fast, and it's very hard to recognize quickly. And all of the companies that have sort of pent-up demand for services, they enter the market. And those that have had the successful marketing during that time, and we'll talk more detail about what that successful marketing looks like for crisis conquerors. Those that have it basically are able to accelerate, and they receive all of those marketing gains. They had some during the kind of downturn, but they compound during the recovery, all of that investment in marketing. You see that across all 4 recessions. So strategic marketing and investment in marketing really, really matters and powers your growth after. And third, asset investment. So asset investment is essentially accumulating assets that are undervalued during the crisis. That could be acquiring a company, right? That is going to be underpriced or that really needs help. That could be if you're in some type of manufacturing kind of product. It could be like a manufacturing plant or just manufacturing capacity, or like negotiating long-term contracts for manufacturing at prices that are now that are going to reduce your cost structure compared to your competitors when recovery happens. It can also be people. Certainly at top, we've been hiring in strategic areas right now because suddenly all of these people, and for us, we're a service-oriented company, so people are our asset. There's a lot of talented people who are available, who were not available before. And so we're investing in that asset. So R&D, marketing, asset investment, doing that now allows you to do 2 things simultaneously. Shorten and make the downturn more shallow, but then make your growth curve steeper if you can invest in it now. Brings us to number 3, time shift ahead of competitors. And specifically, how you deploy these defensive and offensive strategies matters relative to your competitive set. Let me give you an example. And this is an example very, very similar to for the Staples Office Depot comparison. And by the way, even as I say this, it can be your competitors that you have now, but it can also be your competitors if you're entering the market in a new era, in a new area or industry. So for instance, lots of companies entered the market and became companies actually during the last Great Recession. You know, companies like a Warby Parker, you know, entered around that time. Ironically, it's companies having a little bit of struggle. In this downturn, Airbnb entered in the last time as well. So if we're talking about competitors, your existing ones, but maybe if you're a new company, like your new competitive set. And here's the key. You have to be a little bit ahead of the competitive set, because here's how this works. If you're able to be more strategic and cut costs, more efficiency and effectiveness than your competitors by looking at systems and processes faster, then you can conserve cash faster. Then what happens is, as recovery starts to mount, when you have that cash, because you've conserved cash, now you can invest faster. So meaning you can invest in the R&D and the marketing and the asset investment faster than your competitors. And you can do it while the market is still in downturn, so you can get lower prices. Then when the recovery begins, they're still catching up and you're already reaping the benefits of that investment. So time shift ahead of competitors. So what really matters as you're doing this is, in your competitive set, can you be more strategic about reducing your costs, but again, not just with labor costs, with improved systems, and then B, actually accelerate the R&D, the marketing, and the asset investment faster than your competitors, so that you can essentially recover faster. And that's the time shift. Brings us to number 4. Stay top of mind with your top customers and leads. So what essentially happens in the characteristics of these recessions is that, and we'll talk about this, there's different types of companies that approach this differently. There's some, they're like freezing all sorts of deals, like they're just not doing business. Others, it's a mixed bag, right? They're freezing some areas, they're doing other things. Others are like, okay, let's, we want to grow this thing. We're not waiting. If we see opportunity, we're going to do it. So there's different types of companies, and you have to look at, how do you stay top of mind with your top customers and leads because there's pent-up demand that once recovery happens, all three of those groups are interested. And so how do you stay top of mind? Let me give you an example of something that's happening now. So for instance, during a lot of this pandemic, obviously hospitals were overflowing. And so they stopped having elective procedures, right? So you're just going to do just treat the actual, kind of pandemic cases. Once elective procedures come back, there's a pent-up demand for all of that to say, okay, if you're someone who's in medicine and you're doing, dental procedures or you're doing plastic surgery, there's a surge to come back. So even during this time of this downturn, the companies that stayed top of mind that relate to elective procedures with customers and their leads, they're going to realize huge gains right now because they stayed top of mind. So that's kind of it's a very short time frame for this. If you're obviously a healthcare related, it was kind of because this is a healthcare triggered pandemic or triggered crisis. It's an example, but it goes the same for every industry, which is if you can during the downturn stay top of mind while demand gets pent up, then once that eases up and that demand is realized, why marketing is so important, then you realize gains much faster. And so here's just a point I want to make, just an observation, which is there is a new stay-at-home economy. That's different than sort of the gig economy or the remote, services or the, online economy versus bricks and mortar economy. It's related, but it's actually different. This idea of that there are services related to stay at home. And those have more people playing games online, shopping online, learning new things online, streaming movies at home. And what is interesting is, so those are obvious fields. People are like, okay, I get that, these are fields that can grow a lot, like remote work companies or let's say food delivery companies or game companies that can do online games. So those are all obvious. But what is not as obvious is that all of the suppliers to those companies are actually there's opportunity for growth now. So for instance, we have a lot of cybersecurity clients at top. Cybersecurity clients, they're booming now because they supply, if things are going to go more digital for like the online, playing games online or shopping online or remote work online, then they're the companies that protect that online experience. So they're booming as well. So if you actually look at these industries and you actually look at how do you shift your focus and think about it, it's not that you have to be in an industry that is an obvious winner. If there's winners and losers in the new economy, it's that you have to figure out how to supply the winners, be related to the winners, and fuel the winners, and you can be a part of that winning group as well. Brings us to point number 5. Target those who can do business now. So we've been playing the midterm game and the long-term game. We can see this in all of the literature and the data from Crisis Conquerors. But there's a certain amount of shifting your focus to limit the downturn now by focusing on those who can do business now. And the trick with this, and we do a ton of this because we do a lot of brand strategy work at Top and PR Hacker. We do a lot of brand positioning work. And the key is that you have to do things differently during a recession than you normally do things. So here's the typical playbook for how do you figure out who you want to target for your business. You very commonly, we just for our clients, we'll look at personas. We'll say, okay, what are the personas? Who are the actual buyers? What are they like? We'll look at it strategically. We'll look at personas and how they compare to the personas of competitors. We'll look at white space that's available. We'll look at what are their characteristics, what industries are they in, what demographics do they have, how do they make their decisions, what is their consumer or customer buying journey. We'll go into all of that. All that's great stuff. And by the way, if you don't have that as a baseline, you really should. There's a lot of clarity, and the clarity is important because it makes business decisions easier. When you have clarity, you have a guiding North Star. So when a lot of chaos happens, you're not sure what to do, you can always go back to the North Star. That's why strategy matters. But here's the part that's different, given all of that. And it's this next slide, which is in a crisis, industry segmentation or persona segmentation may be less relevant than psychological segmentation. It takes into consideration what a decision maker thinks and their emotional reaction to the economic environment. So are there companies that are, in the mindset of what we talk about, the prevention focused companies, right? It's all defensive, right? Difficult to convert on a new deal unless you can somehow help their defense. If they're an offensive-minded company, that's great. Or if they're a progressive or distill-focused company, that's great as well. So you actually have to reassess your customer base and think about your customers or your consumers that you're trying to reach in terms of their psychological segmentation. You have to redo your personas and actually look at who and what are the characteristics of those with the psychological and emotional makeup to do business now, right? And in fact, who are the crisis conquerors? Can you recognize them? Who are the companies that are going to be more aggressive? So that becomes more important. So just key things and the difficulty is you've got to pivot pretty fast on this. So sales teams are built around we know our personas, we know our industries, this is what we do. And essentially in this hugely disruptive event, you've got to redo that quickly and hone in on which customers or consumers have the psychological makeup to allow you to maximize and optimize that result now. Brings us to number 6. And I'm going to give you a couple bonus points. Know your soul and outsource everything else. So what happens in a crisis is there's a lot going on. There's a lot to manage. And suddenly companies that are very operationally very stable or their sales team is very stable, it's disruption. So you don't know where to spend your time. You don't know what to do. And so a key characteristic of the crisis conquerors is that they focus on essentially what is their core competency, which is what I call the soul of the company. So you got to know your soul so you can focus on it. And then these other things you have to do, like invest in R&D and invest in marketing and invest in asset, sort of accumulation. It's better to outsource that and retain your soul. So what is your soul? You could be a company that you are a technology company. That's at the heart of your soul. You solve problems through technology. If that, in a crisis especially, if that's your core, that is what you focus on, and you should be outsourcing your marketing or outsourcing other things. If you are a company that, let's say you're not a technology company, you are a customer service oriented company, right? You are all about serving the customer. Can't outsource that. You've got to keep that as your core, protect that, outsource other things. Maybe you outsource some of the technology stuff, you outsource the marketing stuff. If you are a company that your soul is, you're all about the brand. That's what you are. You guys, you're a brand. You're a voice. You're an approach. You represent something. You've got to keep that at the core. And maybe you outsource some of the other areas, or maybe if you're looking at your marketing mix, you're saying what do I keep? What do I outsource? You keep brand. Then you outsource other channels and things like that. So know your soul, outsource everything else. And the reason the outsourcing becomes important is essentially you've got to keep focus. And Justin, I see you there on the screen. There's trusty producer Justin. Do we have a question from the audience?
We do. We have a question coming from Mark Winnitz. It's a two-parter, but it sort of stems off of where we're at right now in the presentation. He asks, from a general comms perspective, what are your recommendations for how to stay top of mind and focus on customers that can do business now? And then the second part of that is, what types of messages should you be sending that break through and are relevant? Thank you, Mark, for the question.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And I hope everyone could hear that. I was realizing kind of my multi-camera computer setup here that I needed to hear Justin saying the questions. So hopefully you didn't get too much feedback there, but let me just repeat the question. So the question was about what can you do to sort of to be relevant, stay top of mind, be timely in this so that you can target your most important customers. That's a great question. And actually we have, at Top and PR Hacker, we have 27 different blueprints for exactly this. Let me give you a couple examples. So one is we call is essentially what we call the geo ranking. So a geo ranking blueprint is, let's be relevant based on geography. We know that in this current pandemic that people in different geographies, different cities, different states, different countries are affected differently. So how can we produce a result that is relevant to the local area and use that to enter the conversation? So let me give you an example. At Top, one of our agencies is called Top Data. Top Data focuses on data-driven thought leadership, and we do a lot of data studies. So one of the data studies that we released from Top Data was actually looking at a geo ranking, this blueprint um, of a national stress index. We actually looked at Google Trends data to look at searches on Google related that are stressed, that are people who are stressed out. Which states are the most stressed and what are they stressed about? Then we use that to actually pitch TV, radio, magazine, newspaper, online, and appear on air and earn media. And I've been actually doing these TV interviews here from sort of my remote station. Actually, I'm here currently kind of holed up in Queensland, Australia. So I've been doing it from here and doing all of these media interviews related to that. So that's the essence of the geo-ranking. How do we be relevant to a local geography? You can also do this by looking at something, here's a second blueprint called Think Small. So Think Small is all about how can we be a thought leader to a specific niche that wants to do business now, that is a customer we should stay top of mind, and let's be more precise than everyone else. So an example of this is, okay, let's say you've got a software tool that assists with social media. Well, you could come and say, I want to be a thought leader on all of social media. Okay, that's a big area. So instead, let's be a thought leader in social media for, let's say, SaaS companies that are targeting millennials who have a certain characteristic. So that area of thought leadership, usually there's no one who's that specific. So by thinking small and focusing like what's relevant for those SaaS companies, focused on millennials of a certain type right now, you can be really relevant to that group. So those are two strategies of many, but the point is that add value to the conversation and then your value proposition gets to ride along with it. Okay, so brings us back to point number 6, know your soul and outsource everything else. And certainly if it's a question of being relevant or being timely, we're available and top, and I'll give my email address at the end as a resource as well. And then Justin, we can add it to the chat channel as well. Just my ben.kaplan@topagency.com. Brings us to point number 7. Leverage the moment to gain market share. So the key characteristic about recessions and the moment is that it's actually an acceleration of accumulating market share, largely because other market players are disrupting. Their eyes taken off the ball. They're retrenching. They're just trying to survive. They're not doing the dual focus lens. They're not adapting the crisis conquer philosophy. So leveraging the moment means there's a few things that are special that you can't normally do, that you can do. One is it can be easier to launch products. It's a little bit counterintuitive because you say, well, gosh, the entire focus is on COVID-19 right now. How do we have enough bandwidth to be heard? Well, one, the coverage shifts and it's an ebb and flow, and we're even seeing that now. So the focus was just on raw numbers, right, that are affected by the pandemic, people who are sick, or people who are dying, all of those numbers. It's actually shifting to more of an analysis now of what does this mean? What is the new normal? So one, it doesn't always persist, it shifts. And two, it's an opportunity to release more products because there's just less activity from competitors to compete with those products. People are in survival mode. So leveraging the moment to gain market share means there's a great opportunity, for instance, to release new products that you might have held on to in the past, but if you can release it now, is a great benefit. I can tell you that at Top and at PR Hacker, two of our top agencies, we are launching a lot of products right now. We're launching that, and we're launching them in places where we're being timely and related to what's going on, and we're using that to launch products and actually gain market share faster than we otherwise could. Brings us to point number 8. Accelerate your thought leadership. If there is one thing that I would recommend to invest your marketing, and specifically, we see this across all of the crisis conquerors that became oftentimes thought leaders during the crisis. We see this in that data. We see this across lots of industries that we track. So we have agencies like Top Finance, focused on finance industry, Top Education, focused on education, Top Tech. These are all different industries that we work in and we track. And we have Top B2B, that's all kinds of B2B businesses. What we found is that because there is so much disruption in a crisis, there's so much unknown, There's so much that is new. It accelerates thought leadership. What used to take 2 years to become a thought leader in, you can do in 3 months. What used to take, lots of, data work and data studies that accumulates, you can kind of do very quickly. Why? Because everything has changed and people are hungry for this. So if there is one thing to do in your marketing that is critical as a crisis conqueror, it is invest in thought leadership, accelerate your thought leadership, do thought leadership that impacts you now so it can drive sales now, but that also impacts you for the future, that essentially positions you for that medium and long-term gain once recovery begins. And one of the fastest ways to establish your thought leadership is to become a source of truth for data in your industry. I can't emphasize this enough, and this is particularly important for companies that do not have a monopoly position in their industry. So when you have a monopoly position, right, you get to control everything. The great part about data is that it gives really good data, gives you a monopoly on data. And if the data is good, people have to come through you to get to it. So it's a way to assert yourself, make yourself relevant, make yourself timely, turn yourself into a thought leader, have a monopoly on a piece of information that everyone wants. And if you do that well, the product value proposition gets to ride along with it. So that data piece, and I often get a lot of questions about that. It doesn't just have to be internal data. It can be internal data. You can do surveys as a primary thing at Top Data. We do surveys almost every day. We use a lot of external data like Google Trends. We're constantly mining to get insights that we can turn into data that's useful. We will mine other public sources of data. We'll look at Twitter, sentiment analysis. We'll scrape job postings on popular job sites to be like, what are the trends and how people are hiring? So you can use a lot of external data, but the key is that thought leadership is fantastic for crisis conquerors to invest in, top performers, and particularly data is a shortcut to thought leadership because it makes you valuable. And if you're valuable, you have great value. Justin, do we have another question?
We do. Sorry, I was muted. We have another question from Mary Rockman. What do we do for companies that continue to cut budget and demand the same level of expertise and hours to service their business with the threat of, if we don't perform, that might end the relationship?
Okay, great. It's a great question. Let me actually repeat the question. So the question was about what do we do for, okay, we have customers who are just as demanding, even though they wanted to cut costs, right? They're like, yeah, we can't afford that, cut this, but then they have the same level of demands. There's a couple things you need to do and look at, and it's a very common problem. So number one, and we do this a lot in kind of how we advise our clients, is you've got to find ways to deliver the objective, even if the deliverables are different. So what happens is a lot of times the objectives can't change. Company still wants to grow. Company still wants to gain customers in this way. Company still wants to achieve these goals. Now, what could be different is the deliverable used to get there. So you say, okay, yeah, your objective is this growth. We're going to absolutely meet that objective. But the delivery of that in terms of how we report that, how often we adjust the strategy, all these things that kind of drive cost for us might be different. And you kind of have to be upfront about that. And you have to do that in the cost conversation, ideally upfront. So one, maintain objective, because that's important, but shift the path to objective. Number two, give opportunities to have a baseline amount of service or product or value with opportunities to increase that or improve that or enhance that. So what may happen is one of your customers or one of your clients may not realize they need something from it. They might say like, yeah, you cut costs. Yeah, I don't need that. And then you get 1 month down the road and it's like, no, I absolutely need that. So what's important is in that discussion, if you're rescoping things or you're doing things differently or delivering different value, do you have a plan and do you have something negotiated for, okay, we actually do need to return to a level that was more similar to where we were before in terms of what we're delivering. Here is how that's going to work, and make a clear and consistent plan for that. And then three, final thing is just be really transparent with your clients or your customers and have an open type of communication. So ideally, you want the kind of client relationship where you can have a phone call, you can chat about it. So if anyone feels that value is not being delivered both ways, or that you can talk about. Justin, do we have another question?
Yes, Ben. We have another question from Noura Keskavari. How do you integrate thought leadership into the ongoing operative work and marketing? And I'm assuming that's definitely within the context of the pandemic right now.
Okay, sure. I think one of the things, and the question was, how do you integrate like sort of thought leadership in everything else that you do in the context of kind of like all of the work that you do when it sort of seems like it's this other thing, I have to do. So one of the key things about it is try to find ways that the thought leadership you do actually fuels your other daily activities and that you leverage it in multiple ways. So for instance, if you are doing work for a client or a customer and it's specific to them, but then that work can be generalized and abstracted into something that's valuable to more people. Or you can do this project for a customer or a client, and then suddenly you can like take the lessons of it and turn it into a webinar like this one. Or you could turn it into something else. Try to leverage multiple things that you're doing to create that. The second thing is actually something that's so important that I think this is a huge tip and a huge way to save cost, even as you do thought leadership. And as you create content, is approach the principles of what we call stackable content. And what stackable content is essentially, let's create content in a more efficient and scalable manner by focusing on pillar content, like pillar thought leadership content, like one thing we want to make, and then deriving from it macro, micro, and nano content. So essentially, instead of being like, if you're going to make like 20 pieces of thought leadership content, it's hard, it's time consuming, it's costly to be like, what are 20 things I can create? Here's one, here's two, here's three. Instead of that, create content stacks. Focus on one thing that becomes your pillar content. Then from that, flow out maybe a couple pieces of macro content that amplify on the themes of the pillar content. Then derive micro content that maybe deploys it across social channels, different social platforms. Then have nano content that like fuels your, I don't know, it could be your Instagram story or other type of less polished content. So that is a much more efficient way. So just to kind of recap, try to make thought leadership related to your day-to-day work. You don't have to do something that's totally different. 2, create content stackable content. And if that is interesting and useful, we have a whole division of our company and our agency that just does stackable content. That's very efficient. So we can help you like get started in that. And then you can take over from that on your own once we get kind of like the tracks in place. I know we're wrapping up, running towards the end of the session. Justin, do we have any other last questions before I probably end with the most important thought of the day?
Ben, I just put out into the chat if there's any other requests. So if we have anything that pops up in the end here, I'll let you know. But proceed.
Okay, sounds great. So Justin, thank you for that. So if you have any last questions, put it in the chat. Let me give you my contact information, and then let me actually end on the most important tip and advice of the day. So 1, happy to answer any questions beyond this webinar. And I'll give you I'll tell you what the webinar is coming up next week and sort of if this has been valuable to you, what you can do next. So 1, you can email me at ben.kaplan, so ben.kaplan @topagency.com. That works, that gets right to me. You can also tweet at me at Benjamin Kaplan. I love answering things on Twitter. That's great. Happy to answer your questions, chat about any of this. Number 2, in terms of what we're releasing, we're going to be releasing soon. And if you want this, email me for it. Or certainly you can just go on like the topagency.com website or even prhacker.com, fill out the form, mention this, and I'll get this to you. We're going to do a crisis conqueror checklist. And we're going to do kind of like a strategic checklist of what are the things that you need to do to be in that top 9% and have an itemized list to see if you're doing it. So it's just a thought process to make sure you're doing all the steps. We're going to release that next week or 2. So email me, ben.kaplan @topagency.com, or just message the Crisis Conqueror checklist. If you go to one of our websites, we'll get that to you coming up, number 2. And then number 3, we're going to be doing a new webinar every week on a lot of the themes, all related to the current crisis and pandemic. This is kind of setting the stage of the overall how to be a crisis conqueror, pivot, don't pause. And what's coming up next week is we're going to actually do a webinar called How to Become a Thought Leader. And I know we had a bunch of questions on that today. So specifically, what are the mechanics of becoming a thought leader? Why is it accelerated during the current pandemic and crisis? And what can you do right now to accelerate that process? And there's a whole, both science and art to do it. You can do it strategically. We're going to talk about data and how you use data to do that. We're also going to talk about what are the amplification channels for thought leadership. So next Wednesday, we haven't posted the link yet, but stay tuned for that. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on that, just email me at ben.kaplan@topagency.com and I'll get that to you. So let me end on kind of the one more thing in the final thought of the day, and I think this will be probably the most important piece of advice. And that is, if you look across the 4 recessions, the 2008 Great Recession, 2000 dot-com bubble, the 1990 slowdown, the 1980 decline, the universal truth that becomes apparent is that most companies will be disrupted and will have a long time to recovery. But there is a small subset of companies that this will accelerate everything. For those companies, these crisis conquerors, the top performers, the ones who pivot, don't pause, this will actually speed up, and a process that for a certain market position that would have taken 10 years, they're going to do it in 2. And so with crisis, it's how we started. There is great opportunity, and that's why a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And as you look at that, and as you make those choices, there's a few principles that you must do. You must deal with the short term, but invest in the long term. You don't get to take a pass in the long term. If you want to be a top performer, if you want to grow, you don't get to only think about short term. 2, you've got to absolutely actually use this as an opportunity to improve your core business. You've got to do things more efficiently, more effectively. You've got to reach potential targets and customers better. And this is a time to invest. Crisis equals opportunity. Opportunity equals investment. And you need to invest now. And particularly, you need to develop new innovations and products and services. You need to invest in marketing. We highlighted thought leadership. And you need to find assets that are undervalued to fuel your growth. And you've got to find a way to balance all of that. And when you put this all together, what the opportunity means, and this is across every industry, not just the industries that are the winners, and not just the industries that we think are the losers, is that there's an opportunity for every company to do the strategic pivots, the right combination of defense and offense, to enable fantastic growth. And essentially, over the next 6 months, you, me, all of us have the opportunity to shift our growth curve like this. And the things that we do in the next 6 months are going to determine that. And that's incredibly daunting, and that's incredibly exciting. And so despite how discouraging and how overwhelming this pandemic is, how you can't even imagine for people that have like direct family members affected in a such a fundamental way as health, how difficult that can be. At the same time of this, at the same time that we're entering a downturn, there's an incredible sense of positivity and promise. Because if you can manage this, if you can balance this, if you can find those drivers of growth in the short and long term, this is the opportunity that can accelerate your companies in ways that were not possible before a crisis. So I'm hopeful, I'm excited. I hope you are as well. My name is Ben Kaplan. I'm the CEO of Top, as well as PR Hacker. Thank you for tuning in. Please message me at ben.kaplan@topagency.com, and I wish you all that kind of success. Cheers.